pain is God's microphone to a deaf world. I love that expression. He said, pain is God's microphone to a deaf world. God is speaking all the time. Most of the time, we just aren't listening. We just aren't there.
Father Ron, it's really a joy to welcome you to the podcast. Thank you for taking time to be here with all of us.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to our conversation today, and I'd love to start by asking you to share your heart on why formation, spiritual formation, and Christian maturity are so vital for life and the posture we need to embody as disciples whose lives are aimed at effective formation. Share your heart.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. That's a good question. Let me approach it this way. I think so many of us, no matter the denomination, we get our religious training early, Sunday school or catechism or something, and then it kind of stops, and we don't get a lot more. And so what happens is our professional lives develop, our psychological lives develop, but our religious life in terms of formation stays at a certain level. At a certain point, it's almost like we're bipolar. You're the sophisticated adult in every way, except you've still got, your formation, your religious formation didn't keep up with your other formation, and there's a bipolarity there that, and oftentimes it's not recognized. That so that our religious formation and the learning. I'll put it into an image. Sunday school may never stop, except it stops. and then we keep developing, and we're basically leaving, at least in the way we understand our religiosity, we're leaving it behind. And that causes a lot of problems. That's why a lot of people stop going to churches and so on. There's a schizophrenia almost there.
Let's double click on that. I want to spend some time on that bipolarity as you talked about. Why is it not recognized? What's the disconnect as we're being formed? And I suppose I'll set the landscape this way. We're all being formed. The question is by whom, by what? Why the bipolarity? What do you get a sense of in your decades of ministry? Where's the disconnect?
Well, I'll give you the example. Sometimes I would lecture when I was still in Canada, and I would lecture to school board officials or something. These are professional people with doctorates and so on. But really, in terms of the religious formation, they were still in grade school, so that they're highly professional. They've gone to university, they've developed themselves. And also our culture prides itself on sophistication. And it's one thing when you're 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you still believe in Santa and the Easter Bunny, and that you have a catechesis and a Sunday school that's set for that. But at a certain point, we keep growing, and our religious formation hasn't kept developing. And and I think it's I really believe that we call it adult education or spiritual is just one of the biggest needs in our churches.
So if culture prides itself on sophistication, I'd like to juxtapose that against Jesus' words, unless you become like a little child, by no means shall you enter the kingdom. What is it about the cultural fascination with sophistication that almost sort of, puts blinders on to prioritize the need for continual, regular formation in the heart of hearts?
Okay, let me talk about that. So remember, Jesus didn't say to become childish. He said to become childlike. And see, childlike is, if I can coin some words here, is post-adult. Paul Ricoeur, the great philosopher, I love this expression. He says the task in adult life is to come back to second naivete. You're born as a child. You believe in Santa and the Easter Bunny. You're naive. And you're meant to outgrow that. We're meant to become sophisticated. But at a certain point, sophistication, that's where where I really criticize our culture. Our culture makes sophistication an end in itself. Ever more boundaries, more taboos. No, sophistication is a stage you pass through, and then you come to a second naivete, which is a simplicity that's no longer simple or naive, I had a prof once. He said, I like this image. He says, if you ask a naive child, do you believe in Santa, the Easter Bunny? He says yes. If you ask a bright child, do you believe in Santa the Easter Bunny? They say no. If you ask a really bright child, do you believe in Santa the Easter Bunny? They smile and they say yes for a different reason. See, sophistication is something we pass through, and our culture values as an end. That's why we're always breaking taboos and pushing boundaries further, further, further. And that's good for a while, but we're meant to pass through that to come back to a childlikeness. Um, you know, and see, so Jesus didn't say be childish. Don't remain at naivete, but you don't remain at the level of sophistication either. We need to pass through and see. Our catechesis hasn't kept up to step 2, which is sophistication, not alone to step 3 to bring you back to childlikeness. And also, and I think this is where conservatives struggle. Conservatives and liberals both struggle. Liberals struggle with making sophistication an end in itself. Conservatives, because of the instinct for childlikeness, they sometimes wish you could bypass that middle stage. I don't know, do you have kids? And you almost wish they wouldn't grow up, that they wouldn't have to pass through all those awkward years. And yet you can't get there. See, you can't move from childishness to childlikeness without going through some phase of sophistication, of learning. So I don't know if you get my image here, but I love the expression, which is not my own, but from Paul Ricoeur, but he calls it to come to second naivete. That would be the philosophical expression of Jesus, come to childlikeness.
Is that sort of like stage theory? If I think about it in the realm of psychology, order, disorder, reorder, X, Y to Z. Does that in your mind sort of relate to psychological stage theory in terms of our human development?
I don't, I'm not an expert in psychological stage theory. It sounds like it, but, I always want to be careful that, most of the psychology I studied, for all its depth and wisdom, doesn't bring you to their end game. Oftentimes isn't childlikeness, See, and the gospel end game is childlikeness. Jesus wants you to be a full adult, to handle all the intellectuality of our culture, and then at the end still be childlike. To be like a child. See, I'm not sure psychology, and I'm not sure I'm being fair, has the same end game in mind. Because and validate. So they want to keep you integrated and happy and so on. But I haven't seen a lot of psychologists use the word like simplicity, naivete. I see it in a philosopher like Paul Ricoeur, but he's rare. See, I think today's psychology, again, I don't want to be too critical, but I think it falls into our cultural ethos and trap that sophistication overall. Remember, Luther said, salvation through faith alone. I think our culture says salvation through sophistication alone. And Jesus puts a different end game to that.
Yeah, I'd like to stay on this idea of the second naivete, childlikeness, because really the focus, where I'd love to spend a portion of our time today talking about really the things that keep us from active awareness of the presence of the Lord. And I think about what you've established for us, childlikeness, the ability to perceive and to know and to hear. As I told you before we got going here today, your book, The Shattered Lantern, absolutely changed my life, and I'm so thankful for it. And in it, you wrote this, quote, "The struggle to experience God is not so much one of God's presence or absence as it is one of the presence or absence of God in our awareness."
Yeah.
God is always present, but we are not always present to God. Father Ron, unpack that for us.
Yeah, no, it's let me just unpack it. But the statement kind of says it. First of all, God is always present. It's not a question of God being present or not present. But we aren't always present to God. We always don't make space in our life for God. And it's interesting. Let me draw something out which is in spirituality, and that is, more lately people have often quoted this line from Leonard Cohen, where he says, there's a crack in everything. And that's the way the light gets in. See, so for many of us, speaking for our culture, when we become aware of our, well, first of all, of our need for God is when life breaks. A tragedy, sickness, a diagnosis, something, and all of a sudden we lose it's almost like a little stick of dynamite that God dynamites himself into our lives by, now that it's not that that's bad, but that's what they call the God of the gaps. You only have God when you're down and out. See, but God is also there in all our good times. But in our good times, let me put it in a quote from Chesterton, the great apologist. Chesterton once said, he says, pain is God's microphone to a deaf world. I love that expression. He said, pain is God's microphone to a deaf world. God is speaking all the time. Most of the time, we just aren't listening. We just aren't there, And then where we pick up God in our awareness oftentimes is in the broken moments, the crack where God can get in, gets in. But so often, Henry Nouwen coined this expression some years ago. He says we're atheistic in our everyday consciousness. We crank up God in our churches. We crank up God on sacred places and different occasions. But normally, our everyday consciousness is agnostic. I shouldn't say there's just we're not shutting God out. We're not letting God in. And remember, the book The Shattered Lantern. I stole that title from Nietzsche. But that. Let me give your listeners here that background story. Now, first of all, Nietzsche was an atheist, but he was a perceptive one. So he wrote this book in the 1880s, a book called The Gay Science. But this is the central image. He has the scene is a town in Germany at high noon. And, it's at the market square. People are shopping and the kids are playing and people are drinking beer and so on. And at high noon, so the sun is really bright. And into the square comes a madman. Every town has a crazy person. And he's got a lantern, a lit lantern. You know how pathetic that is when the sun is out, a little lantern. And he begins to look under benches and stalls. And the people are teasing him. They say, what are you looking for? He says, I'm looking for God. I'm looking for God. And so they say, well, did he get lost? Is he like a little kid? And at a certain point, he goes to the center of the square and he smashes the lantern on the pavement. And he says, God is dead and we're his murderers. We killed God. And actually, at that point, that's even though he's an atheist, he was making quite a statement. He said, see, we've killed God in our ordinary consciousness. There's no God on a market square. You can still go to a church and find God. And in the book, Nietzsche says, or the madman said, I've announced this too soon. So Nietzsche's prediction says, he said, when God dies in the market squares, God is going to die in the churches in another 100 years, there's a lot of challenge in that, so often we make space for God in our churches and sometimes in particular moments of our prayer lives and so on. And then the rest of the time, that's my time, that's secular time, And so God is always there. But let me say something a little more sympathetic too. God isn't a tyrant that demands your conscious attention all the time. God wants you to enjoy life and enjoy the Lions winning a football game once in a while and so on. Sees to that. But God doesn't demand that you always be focused, but the focus, but that you have some undertow that you have a sense, there's a God, and that you make time. It's the same as, do you have kids?
I don't.
Okay, or say same family with kids. The parents don't demand that the kids live their lives around them, but they demand they be home and there be at table and certain. God is a parent, but the problem is never on God's side. God is always. I love that line from Chesterton. Pain is God's microphone to a deaf world. mostly we're deaf. And, God has to dynamite his way into our consciousness.
Let's spring off of that Chesterton quote, which I just think is just profound and brilliant, and even connect that to what you were saying from now. And it makes me think about the idea of practical atheism. Father Ron, for some, he's Lord of some areas of my life, but he's not Lord of all. Anything else you want to say about practical atheism, warning signs, how we drift to that place where I bring him into the areas of life for which I have need, but in other areas, I don't need to trust him. I don't need to depend on him. I don't need to lean on him. And then perhaps we even can connect that back to, if the call is to be childlike, children depend on their parents.
Yeah, I'm glad you went. The central thing I'm going to give you that is get back again to being childlike. When Jesus says, oftentimes he'll bring a child out and say, look at this child. This is the way you need to be before God. Now that's easy to misunderstand, because children, we are often taken and idealized their innocence, which is beautiful. A child's innocence. And we think that's what Jesus is referring to, but it's not. He's not referring to their innocence. He's referring to their helplessness and their dependence. See, a child has no false sense of self-sufficiency. If mom and dad don't get up, it's not going to eat. If it isn't given to them, they don't have it. See, so a child knows it is dependent. It needs to, it's not self-sufficient. It's interesting. Thomas Aquinas, philosophically, I like this. He defined God. He said, God is self-sufficient being, and nothing else is self-sufficient. See, we have the illusion of self-sufficiency. That's also why Jesus is hard on the rich. It's not so much on money, but the danger of being rich is you think you're in control. So let me tell you a story. It's a colorful, it's a wonderful story. I went to a funeral some years ago, the father of one of our priests, okay? And he had lived to age 90, and he had been a good man, but he had been a strong man. He was a guy who was a natural leader. From the time he was a young kid, he was captain of the football team, and then he became captain of this, and he had a very successful company and a big family and so on. And in every area of his life, he was a very strong, devoted Christian man. So he dies at age 90, and his son, as a priest, preached a sermon, funeral homily, and it was a good one. He says, well, we're burying our dad, and he was 90 years old, and scripture says 70 is the sum of a man's years, 80 for those who are strong. He said, now he had got to live to be 90. He said, why the extra 10 or 20 years? He said, not even a big secret. He says, it took God an extra 20 years to mellow him out. He said, he was too strong. He said the last years of his life were years of major diminishment. His wife died and it broke his heart, and then he had a stroke, and then he had to go to assisted living. So I love this ending. He says, so by the time he died, you'd go to visit him, he'd take your hand, he said, help me. He said he couldn't say that since he was 5 years old, since he could tie his own shoes. He couldn't say the word help me. He said, had he died earlier, he'd have been telling Peter and Jesus how to run the pearly gates, He said he was ready to go to heaven. Just help me. See, but see our very strengths, which we need when we're young, and see that can go against our when Jesus said, "Be childlike," okay, there's a simplicity aspect, but especially, I'm not. Everything is a gift. I'm not self-sufficient, and so if I can risk saying something here, wandering a little bit astray. Today, for instance, when a lot of people don't go to their churches and they say, I'm spiritual but not religious. Let's say, well, basically say, I want to, like Frank Sinatra, I don't want things my way. No, but that's not Christian. Christian thing is, we're dependent. Remember Jesus, how often he says this line. He said, I do nothing on my own. I do nothing on my own. I'm perfectly obedient to my Father. And notice the irony of that statement. Jesus is probably the freest man who ever walked this planet. And at the same time, he says, I do nothing. I do nothing on my own. Um, you know, and so that um, the root of childlikeness is the root of I'm not self-sufficient. And that's also the danger of riches. It's not that riches are bad. It's not that God doesn't want you to have money or comfort. The danger of youth and health is that I don't need anything. I'm doing it myself. I'm self-sufficient. Like Thomas Aquinas said, only God is self-sufficient. The rest of us, right now, you and I, we're breathing air, we're relying on the food you've eaten that somebody else produced and so on. There's nothing self-sufficient about us.
How do we break the illusion? If we could double down on this, how do we break the illusion of self-sufficiency?
Well, again, I'm going to get back to almost like the Chesterton quote. Oftentimes, like in the story I told you, notice it wasn't that he had some revelation and he repented. Nature did it for him. It was broken conscriptively. And I think for most of us, the illusion is going to be broken by precisely when we can't do it for ourselves, like when we have to put out our hand and say, "Help me," you know, um, and so that you would hope we could do this proactively. That basically that you don't have to. In fact, the great spiritual writers, that's what they're always counseling, say, do that on your own before it's done to you. You know, um, do that before a cancer diagnosis or something else does it for you. You know, John of the Cross, the great spiritual writer, will say, try to do this proactively. You know, um, give your life over. You know, again, I'll quote a great from Jesus. You know, when Jesus comes before Pilate, and Pilate is trying to intimidate him, he says, "You know, I have power over you. I could kill you or set you free." And Jesus says, "You have no power over me whatsoever." You know, he could have said, "You're a day late." He said, "I gave my life over." He said, "You can't take from me by conscription what I've handed over freely." He said, "Nobody takes my life from me. I give it over freely." You know, see, so with this, we have to, you started with the question of religious formation. That's one of the big things we're going to bring to religious formation. You know, give your life over, break the illusion of self-sufficiency before nature or health or a cancer diagnosis or something else or something that breaks your heart does it for you, um, because it'll be done for you unless you do it yourself, because everybody has to go through that purification. And you know, if we, Jesus would say, do it before they do it to you. You know, nobody takes my life from me. I give it over freely.
What I heard you say is, and you can expound on this to the extent you'd like, perhaps an aspect of what's missing then in the formation conversation is this um, this breaking of dependency upon self. Is that what I hear you saying? Is that something you're observing that's missing in spiritual formation in these conversations?
Well, you know, you're right. You put your foot on your finger on the problem. Except the way I'd solve it is not by, you know, how do you break your dependency in yourself? You know, you see, you don't do that without something else in mind. You do it by deeper entry into community. See, you know, it's not, you don't break your dependency for the sake of just breaking it, you know. You break it for the sake of deeper entry into community, you know, which, you know, then, you know, just explodes into Christianity in terms of that means I can learn, I have to forgive people. I have to forgive myself. I have to learn to let go of things, you know. It's a movement beyond ego. Um, but see, but the end game isn't, you know, to make yourself a spiritual athlete. The end game is to make yourself somebody who can sit at the heavenly banquet table with everybody. You know, a friend of mine, I love this expression. He says, the heavenly table is open to everyone who's willing to sit down with everyone, you know, and that's the challenge. The theologian Gloria Previs always said, she says, I try to get along with everybody, knowing I'm going to have to spend eternity with them. You know, so the end game is for you, Christopher, you're not to make yourself a spiritual athlete. You know, you want to keep yourself spiritually in shape and trim, but the end game is always community of life with God, with others, with and um, and that means breaking the ego, um, and that means giving up the illusion of self-sufficiency. You know, I'm my own person. If I can comment on that again, that I think is a major issue in our culture. And I'll tell you why. Someone always said your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. One of the great strengths of our culture, it's given us wonderful freedoms. We're the freest people who've ever walked this planet. But the downside is we're also the most individualistic people. Today we have a problem of just, almost a pathological individuality. My rights, my freedoms, and some of that, again, I want to be kind to these people, but some of that is behind the statement, I'm spiritual but not religious, which means, the good part is I'm spiritual. But the bad part is, um, um, I want it on my own terms. We have a sociologist of religion in Canada, the original Bibby, a Baptist man, and he's our top sociologist of religion. And he coined this, and I very much like it. They asked him once, why aren't people going to church more? And he says, well, we always blame maybe the preaching isn't good or whatever. He said, you know what the reason is? It's this individuality. And this he coined this, said, notice people are treating their churches the same way as they're treating their families. They want them around, but not much. Kind of, I want my family on my own terms, um, and so I want a church, but on my own terms, See, then there's still notice that the root behind that is individuality, still a self-sufficiency. I'm self-sufficient without my family, but I can turn to him when I need him. I'm self-sufficient without my church. I'll turn to him if I need him. And
So underneath of that, I think about Solomon's admonition to keep and guard our hearts above all that we guard. Everything we do, everything we are flows from that. Underneath the hood of this conversation, perhaps, is an aspect of purity of heart, the call to pursue purity as disciples of Jesus. I'd love to know your take on what's required of us to pursue the purity of heart, so that we can walk in.
That's a big motif. Well, let me first, before I try to say what purity of heart is, I want to nail that down scripturally. See, that's what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount on purity of heart. That's predicated on a lingering question from the Old Testament. See, in the Old Testament, there was this whole motif about who can see the face of God. Remember, Moses said, I want to see God's face and the face of God. But then by the time we get to the Psalms, it becomes like a longing, like my deer that yearns for flowing streams. I want to see the face of God. I thirst to see the face of God. But the Old Testament ends with the question, like, who can see the face of God? And so in the Sermon on the Mount, or the Beatitudes, Jesus says, blessed are the pure of heart. They will see the face of God. And Christopher, that set loose the whole desert tradition of all these monks who went to the desert and so on. And they all had one thing. I'm going out here to seek purity of heart. I want to seek purity of heart, because then you get to see God. Okay. But notice that answers a question that was lingering for 1,000 years. Who can see the face of God? But now, what is purity of heart? Okay. Well, Jesus, the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor and the meek and so on. Let me give it just from one great spiritual thinker, the great mystic John of the Cross. And it's practical. It's not mystical language up in the sky. John of the Cross would say, right now, two things prevent that are, and we're born with them. We're born with two things inside of us that we need to overcome to come to purity of heart. And the first one is the gratification principle. He says you're born, he calls it with disordered affectivity, inordinate affectivity. And that is when a baby is born, and babies are wonderful and they're beautiful and so on, but they're not unselfish. They can't be. It's just, and see, that's what psychologists call the pleasure principle. And that we do things because there's something in it for us. Okay. Now, John of the Cross would say, whenever we're acting off of this, we're not really seeing purely. We're not just God. We're not seeing other people purely either. The the sex-obsessed teenager who's putting pressure on his girlfriend said he's not seeing her. See, it's coming out of his own need and so on. So John of the Cross, the first and major maturity we have to come to in life, spiritually and psychologically, is to break the pleasure principle, where you start doing things not because they mean something to you, because they mean something in themselves. In fact, if I can, I hope you allow me to use one colorful word here. Okay, so it's a good story. But I don't know if your listeners know who Annie Lamott is.
Her books stand alone in terms of
Okay,
my
so
written
you know
career.
who she is.
Yeah,
But anyway, she's this
I
colorful
certainly
writer,
do.
and I love this line. There's going to be a colorful word, Annie Lamott word in it. But she says her own son. Said she raised his son Samuel, and she says, and said I virtually raised this kid in church. Said then he gets to be 14, 15. He comes one Sunday morning. He says, "Mom, I don't want to go to church anymore." She says, "When?" It says, "Because it doesn't mean anything to me." Now I love her answer. You know what she said? She said, "I couldn't give a whether it means anything to you." Okay, that's the bad word. She said, "That's a child's answer." She said, "It doesn't have to mean anything to you." She said, "First of all, it means something to me. I'm your mother. It means something to these people. They love you." She said, "And it means something itself. It's like visiting your grandmother. You don't visit your grandmother because that's what adults do. And that colorful, it nails it. It nails it. See, it doesn't mean it. Doesn't have these things mean something themselves. See, when I'm operating off the pleasure principle, it's what does it mean to me? What do I get out of it? What's the angle? When we're mature, that's the first purification. Um, it it doesn't have to mean anything to you. You're doing it because it means something. You do it for yourself. Incidentally, that's one of the movements in prayer. When we first get serious about prayer, oftentimes, like the mystics say, you're going to have a lot of fervor in your prayer. It's going to feel good, but that's going to dry up. you know and then you start praying not because it feels good, because that's what adults do. You go to church not because it feels good, that's what you do. You show up at your family table not because you always want to be there, because those things, they mean something themselves. So it says you visit your grandmother because it means something. Okay, now John of the Cross would say that's the basic movement. He said, and a lot of adults get there. A lot of adults, he said you never get there perfectly. There's always some selfishness, but we're essentially unselfish. you know. Um, but then he says there's a major purification that has to take place later on in life. Um, and that is that we have to be purified of our own metaphysics. Um, and this is a little more complex. I wish I had a diagram to show you, but I'll put it simply this way. Our metaphysics says, we're composed of three things. And psychologists today would say the same thing. You have a head, you have a heart, you have a gut. See, and you think with your head, you feel with your heart, and your gut is really your center. It's kind of your moral center. So John of the Cross said, for most of your life, your head has to work with images.
Mhm.
Your head
Mhm.
doesn't like no pictures. If I say lake, you get it. Boat, you get a picture. Even something abstract, I say beauty, you have a picture. If I say backs, BAX, your head is frustrated, no picture. Um, and say your heart normally wants to possess. You like something, you want it. And your gut, you know what? Your gut wants two things they want. Your gut wants control, and your gut wants security. You don't like being insecure, you don't being out of control, and so on. Now, he said, these serve you well, even when you're mature. He said, but they don't get you to heaven. Now, what gets you to heaven is faith, hope, and charity. And I'm going to link them to those three things. He said, you know what faith is? He says, that's when you know and you don't have a picture. You can't get a picture, you know. Um, and love, Christian love, faith, hope. Charity is when you love and it's not possessive. And hope is when you can't guarantee your security. You can't uh, be controlled. You just have to trust. You just have to trust. And he said, and that, so that our classical Christian virtues of faith, hope, and charity, they're the ultimate purification. Um, now, let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate that. In fact, he has a curious expression that I really like. John of the Cross says, at this stage of your life, he said, or a certain stage of your life, he said, you have to learn to understand more by not understanding than by understanding. Learn to understand more by not understanding by understanding. Give you an example of what he means by that. Suppose, Christopher, somebody comes up to you and says, Christopher, I've known you and I've known your family. I've known your family for 40 years, and I know who you are. This is your ethnicity. This is your Myers-Briggs number. This is your Enneagram number. These are your temperament and stuff. Do you feel very well understood? No, you feel violated. They've got you in all kinds of boxes. If somebody comes to you and says sincerely, Christopher, I've known you and your family for 40 years, and you're a mystery to me. You are a mystery to me. Now you're understood, so you can be yourself. See, and when we go through life, when we put each other and God in boxes and images, and that's why dark nights of the soul come along. God just takes away the boxes and the images, Um, but I'll give you, your readers, listeners can check this out. Some years ago, actually in the early 80s, there was a play came out, quite well known, and eventually a movie called Children of a Lesser God. And that's almost a classic. You could use that as a textbook example here, but this is the story. It's a story of a young woman. She's born and she's deaf and she's mute. And the problem with this is she's also highly, highly intelligent and highly, highly high-strung. And so what happens is no teacher can teach her. She's smart and she chews them up. And then one day, a young man, gifted teacher, he becomes your teacher, and he is gifted enough that he can break through. And he brings her into, sign language and all this type of stuff and so on. But it's also a love story. Then they fall in love and they get married. Okay. And they don't live happily ever after. Okay. They get married and, they're wildly in love. And then, and she's so deeply grateful, but at a certain point, she just feels the need. She has to push him off. She just, and she feels really badly. And she tells him, it's terrible. Like you saved my life and I need to push you away. And he doesn't get it either. He said, well, you're reading feminist books. That's what's turning your head. And finally, their relationship breaks. And their last conversation is this, he's figured it out by then. But she says to him, I need to go away, at least for a time. And she said, I feel so bad because you were such a great teacher. Then he said this, he said, no, I wasn't a great teacher. He said, I was a good teacher. I was a good teacher. He said, but I taught you to understand yourself, but not better than I understand you. I taught you to be free, but not so free that I couldn't control you anymore. I wanted you to have a free life, but still dependent on me. See, I taught you to understand yourself, but not better than I understand you. See, that's the way John of the Cross would say, our head, our heart, our personality, they serve us well late into life, late into maturity. And then at a certain point, we have to, again, childlikeness, let go. It's just, I don't understand. See, and then there's room for faith. There's room for real charity. There's room for hope. So that, and that we can, for instance, when we die, the movement of death is a movement to pure faith and hope. Basically, we don't know where we're going. We just have to trust you're no longer in control. And that's the ultimate purification of purity of heart. So basically, it's purity of heart is two levels of maturity. The basic one, which serves basically, we got to get beyond the pleasure principle. I do it because it's good for me. It's something in it for me, and then later on to move to a new childlikeness where we don't understand. We don't want to understand. We just want to let it go. We don't let God and others be free.
I'd like to try to draw a thread through some of the wisdom you've shared with us today in thinking about the call to childlikeness, the second naivete, as we've identified, dependence upon the Lord. And I think about, and please correct me, I think about the call to have a single eye, to have single vision, purity of heart. As you said, Jesus said, the pure in heart will see God. Well, what is that about seeing? I think about seeing requiring single vision, that my eye is sound, my body would be filled with light, that the eyes of my heart would be filled with insight and understanding into the knowledge of Him. Father Ron, is there anything else we should know about what it takes to see God? to really see him as Father, to see him as the one who called us by name in our mother's womb and ascribed to us identity. But I think about in the realm of childlikeness and dependence, like seeing God requires those things. But I'd love to hear your wisdom.
Yeah, part of the seeing, and I struggle with seeing, is that it's not so much that we're seeing, we're trying to see everything all at once. You talked about singleness of heart. Let me start with that. That's a key thing. Kierkegaard, the great Lutheran philosopher, and I love this. This is still my favorite definition of a saint. He said, to be a saint is to be able to will the one thing. To be able to will the one thing. You can will God. You can will service to others and so on. And that sounds so simple, but it's the most difficult thing in the world. Why? It's not that we don't want to will God and we don't want to will service and so on to others. We don't want to will unselfishness. The problem is we want to will everything else as well. Philosophers used to say every choice is a renunciation, except I'd say every choice is 100 renunciations. If you do this, you can't do that. And Henry Nouwen once put just some perfect pastoral language to this. Henry Nouwen, as was so honest about his own struggles. He's a saint for our times. He lived out a spiritual discipline, but he shared his struggles. So Henry Nouwen wrote in his diary, he said, I want to be a great saint, but I also want to experience all the sensations that sinners experience. He said, I want to have a deep life of prayer, but I don't want to miss anything. He said, I want to have a radical lifestyle for ecology, but I want to get in airplanes and fly all around the world, Notice the honesty. He says, I want the right things, but, my struggle is I want all these other things too, so that, in the book, The Holy Longing, I contrast three people on that. And so you take a clear case. So I took like Mother Teresa, everybody acknowledged saint, but see, she just willed God and the poor and just, she became this snowplow through history,
Yeah.
But then on the other side, I took like rock singers. You take somebody like Janis Joplin or Michael Jackson, people see, but they're actually very spiritual people in their own way, but they will everything. They try to drink the whole world and they die in their 20s. Like Janis Joplin died at 27 years old, and not that she killed herself. If you saw the movie on Elvis Presley, it's just, it takes them, and they're good people, but there's no discipline. The third person I took was Princess Lady Diana, and because, she was the perfect example. She'd go and spend a month with Mother Teresa, work with the poor, pray with her every day. Then she'd come back and go on a Riviera, kind of a jaunt with a playboy, so back and forth. So when she died, it was interesting. Her brother gave the eulogy, and it was a combination of some not very good, but then some brilliance. So he began, kind of stupidly, with the old line, with the Beatles more popular than Jesus Christ, kind of stuff. Said there'll be a rush to canonize my sister, but she's bigger than all of that. And I thought, that's nonsense. But anyway, but then he redeemed himself. He says, my sister was very much loved. And people said she's the people's princess. Said, why? He said, well, the simplistic answer is she was a beautiful woman. He said, no, a lot of women are beautiful. They're hated for it. He said, why she was loved? She said, because she couldn't protect people from seeing her weakness. She was a weak, vulnerable person who never pretended to be otherwise. That basically, precisely, she was a mixture of saint and sinner. She was a mixture that, and see, but her struggle is the struggle of so many people. Not everybody can do the Mother Teresa thing. And most people, fortunately, are not going to do the Janis Joplin thing. But our struggle is the Henry Nouwen thing. I want to be a saint. I want to be under this discipline, but I have all these temptations and distractions. I want to have a deep prayer life, but I don't want to put the time in. I don't want to miss anything. There's a football game on television. We're busy, so that it's the problem of not being able to choose. And you see it in our culture, for instance, where a lot of young people, I don't want to pick on young people, older people aren't any better, really struggle to make commitments. Say, well, I don't think I want to get married. I'll live together, see how it works out. I don't want to shut down options. Like if I pick you, then I can't pick anybody else for the rest of my life. See, that's the struggle, to will the one thing. And that's one of the huge struggles in the spiritual life. And it comes in the fact that we're the way God made us. Actually, I would say God is to blame. God made you in God's image and likeness. You have divine appetites. Nothing in this world is going to satisfy you. And so, in the meantime, you'd like to drink in the whole world, and we can't.
We can't. Earlier in the conversation, Father Ron, you mentioned the dark night of the soul, and I'd love to spend just a little time on that. I'd love to hear your wisdom on that experience. You can take as much time as you'd like. Like, why does it happen? How do we navigate it? How is it used to form us?
Okay, take it from the top. What is it? A dark night. So first of all, the mystics say God does that to you. But basically, what it is it's after religious fervor. So and it happens to actually it's a good thing, and it only happens to mature religious people. That's has to be distinguished from normal, agnosticism and so on. But it's somebody who's been praying, they've been faithful, and all of a sudden God seems to disappear from their life. Basically, you can't pray anymore the way you used to. You can't even imagine. And sometimes you start thinking, say, do I believe in God? You say, I don't think I believe in God anymore. You try to imagine God existing and you can't. Now, what's happened there is this, that it's not that God disappears, okay? It's not a failure of faith, it's a failure of your imagination, that, let me give you an image. Pictures, it was Thomas Keating, the great writer on prayer. He has a wonderful image. He says, imagine this. Imagine you're a mother fish at the bottom of the ocean. And one day your baby fish come up and say, Mother, where's this water everybody talks about? Okay, now they're swimming in water 300 feet deep. So what the mother could do is she'd set up a PowerPoint at the bottom of the ocean and show them slides of water. This is Niagara Falls. This is the tide coming in. This is a water tap. And they'd be intrigued with the pictures, for a while. But at a certain point, she'd say, this isn't water. Those are pictures. I want to turn off the projector and I want you just to swim in the water without images. See, earlier on in faith, we are working with images of God, basically PowerPoint. Even scripture is a PowerPoint presentation about God, but it's not God, see, and so they say sometimes God takes away the experience, the imagination, and wants you just to swim in the water. Remember, scripture says it's in him we live and move and breathe and have our being. But that can be frustrating because you want the pictures, you want the feelings and so on. But notice those aren't God, those are pictures about God, So what do you do about it? Well, first, John the Cross would say, learn to expect that. So when it happens, don't be surprised. When Mother Teresa died and they found out she had this about 60 years of her life, people said, how could that happen to Mother Teresa? You should say, why wouldn't it happen to Mother Teresa? It happened to Jesus on the cross. Remember, a minute before he dies, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so that John the Cross would say, expect it. And when you're there, be patient with it. And this is very important. Know that there's not something wrong in your life. There's something right in your life. Thomas Keating, who I just used him, he was a Trappist monk out in Snowmass in Colorado. He said, people used to fly from around the world to see him. And they described this to him, say, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? And he'd say, God is wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. This is God has turned off the projector to bring you to a different, image of faith. So that, and a lot of times our agnosticism, and I think I say it in the book, is more a failure of our imagination than a failure of our faith. I always tell people, you can't imagine God. It's impossible by definition, because God is infinite. So I give them this simple thing. It says, count to the highest number it's possible to count to and tell me when you get there. But you'll never get there because it's infinite. See, so if it has no ceiling and God has no beginning, you can never, to have a concept, you have to circumscribe it. You got to get around it. And with infinity, you can't. There's no beginning, there's no end. So at a certain point, it's simply beyond human imagination. And but it isn't beyond human knowing. See, our consciousness of what we know is not the same thing as what we know. See, it's more, you're at a conscious level, you can't picture God anymore. You can't, or at an effective level, you can't feel God the way you used to. But God is still there, and God is acting in a much deeper way under the surface. And then it's an interesting image. They talk about the dark night of the soul, but there's an irony, because the reason why the lights go out is not because God disappears, but because it becomes too present. John of the Cross would say there's two times when you can't see: when it's pitch black, and if you're looking straight into the sun. So he says, see, the closer you get to God, the more you're letting the sun come in, the more, in a certain sense, it's going to blind you. So it's not that, we call it a dark night, but it's an excessive light of the soul. Would be better. God becomes so present in your life that it's the fish swimming in the ocean. It's just, you can't. Or sometimes Carlo Creda used another image. He said it's like a baby in a womb. It's completely surrounded by its mother, but it won't be able to see its mother till it's born. The mother is around it too much, so that, see, all concepts we have of God, and you know what the Bible does? The Bible gives us certain concepts that gives us permission to use. They say you may use this without being struck dead, without being a blasphemy or something, but that still isn't. God is it Peter or is it Paul in Scripture? He says, eye hasn't seen, ear hasn't heard, beyond imagination, or Isaiah's vision of the holiness of God. When we say holy, 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 that's not so much a moral statement. It's physical, just beyond, above, beyond. You can't picture, you can't grasp. God is just, it's a, philosophers used to say incorrectly, said, God isn't a being the way you and I are a being, that you can nail it. You're a person and God's like that. You're a person, God's a person, but unimaginable, but not unknowable. The fish are in the water, they're swimming in the water. They can't imagine the water, but they know the water. They're swimming in it.
He's not unknowable. So what's the best way then, when we are in a season such as you've described, what's the best way to position ourselves before the Lord in everyday life? Because if we string this together with the narrative we've constructed, so many of us are driven to what? Control circumstances, control objectives, control outcomes. When we are in this place where we are realizing, oh, we are actually in the water now, what's the best way to posture ourselves, Father Ron, so that we embrace it, so that we learn what we need to learn, so that we grow the roots deeply, so that we mature and are formed into the image of Christ?
John of the Cross would say, just receive it and let go. You got to let go of control. And the interesting thing is, I'll tell you something about dark nights of the soul. They're not like a psychological depression. When somebody's depressed, they take oxygen out of a room. When someone's in dark night of the soul, they bring oxygen into a room. So it's not like an emotional depression. You're actually stronger than you were before, but you're not in control, and you know what? Then God can flow in purely. I've mentioned Nietzsche before. I want to say something about Nietzsche. Nietzsche is one of the greatest atheists ever. But Nietzsche says all revelation, Christian revelation, whatever, it's all us making God in our image and likeness. Christians say we're made in the image and likeness of God. No, we make God in our image and likeness, and all revelation is projection. It's all projection, with self-interest. One of the great profs they ever had, Michael Buckley, said, you know something? He's 90% right, but he's 10% wrong. And that 10% makes all the difference in the world. See, when you have a dark night of the soul, say when you are not in control, then God can flow into you purely. That might only be 10% of your life where, otherwise, we're manipulating it. We're somehow making it work for us. When you're completely helpless, when you are down and out, when you can't do anything, something, grace can work perfectly because you can't spoil it anymore. You can't contaminate it. You can't do anything with it, and see, that's the purpose of dark nights. God knocks your control out, and then God can flow into your life purely. You know um, that see, as long as I'm still in control, I'm going to manipulate that a little bit. I'm going to contaminate the thing. See that. So that's the purpose. It's and all genuine revelation. That's why, like Buckley said, 90% of the time we do this. 10% of the time we don't, and those are the 10% of the time where pure revelation, grace, God can flow into our world without human contamination. Otherwise, we're always fudging it, making the gospel work for us, making God work for us, forming God in our image and likeness. Um, I'll give you a human example of that. It's also true humanly for, I just wrote an article yesterday. I called it Helplessness is Fruitful. When you're the most fruitful, absolutely the most fruitful, when you're the most helpless. When you go to a funeral and somebody lost a son to suicide or something, and Christopher, there's nothing you can say, and you just share their helplessness. Something, it's really powerful. It's really powerful. That helplessness lets God's grace flow in perfectly, in a way that that we say words and so on. But see, when we're helpless, when we're down and out, then grace can flow in. I'll give you a biblical image, and I know I'm a little over time, but when Jesus prays in the garden, when Jesus prays in the garden and he's in the agony in the garden, and then after he finally gives himself over, it said, then an angel came and strengthened him. And you wonder, why didn't the angel come earlier? Why the angel didn't come earlier? It couldn't. It's when he let go of his own strength that God can flow in. See, the angel can only come into your life purely when, you give it all over. When you say, there's nothing I can do here, then God can start working in you. See, because otherwise the danger is I'm going to start manipulating it. I can make it work for me. I'll contaminate grace. I'll contaminate revelation. And, even contaminated grace is good, but pure grace is pure grace.
Wow. Oh, Father Ron, I want to respect your time, of course, as well. Do you have time for a couple more questions, or?
Sure, I
Okay.
can. I'll do in a couple more.
Awesome. You've just given us a treasure trove, especially what you just said about the dark night of the soul. How do we know then? How do we know we're growing?
How do we know we're growing? Sometimes, again, that's not a simplistic question. No, because sometimes we think we're growing and we're regressing, and sometimes you think we're regressing and we're actually growing. Um, spiritual writers would say we should, well, first of all, we should take this all to prayer, but they also say you should have a spiritual director or a mentor or a pastor or even your family, to monitor that, because it is so easy to delude ourselves, and see, sometimes we're inflating and we think we're growing, and sometimes we're deflating and we're actually growing spiritually, so that it's a tricky question. It is so easy, and start with scripture. The Pharisees were the good, sincere, religious people at the time, and they were blind, so often blind to their own hypocrisies and so on.
To the extent you want to share this, I was curious earlier in the conversation, so I wrote it down just so I wouldn't forget, but I'd love to know, because there's a depth of wisdom from which you're teaching all of us today, and I'd love to know this, Father Ron. How have you known God as Father in your own life?
Well, first of all, I was lucky. I'd say something, I had a very good father. I had a very good dad, In fact, my dad was one of the truly moral people I ever met. So then it's a little easier transfer to God as Father. Um, I've worked with people in spiritual direction and students who had a terrible abusive father and so on, or an absent father. Uh, they can really struggle, because we're forming images like, you know, if you had a father whom you respected and was loving and was moral, um, it's easier to come to God as Father. Um, if your father wasn't good, absent, abusive, um, see, then it's going to be a struggle. It's going to be a struggle, and then luckily we have three there. You have Jesus and you have the Holy Spirit. Then relate to Jesus more, um, and um, and in fact, as Christians, we relate to the Father through Jesus in any case. And and so in fact, one of our struggles, I don't know how it's with you, but with Roman Catholics, one of our struggles is um, um, often we don't distinguish when I just pray to God, and but you know, am I praying to Jesus, and the Father, and so on. It's interesting. Saint Ignatius, the great Jesuit founder, in his exercises, when he have to prayers at the end, he has to make separate prayers to the Father and separate prayers to Jesus. Kind of like you're talking with two different people here. But a lot of times we don't make that distinction. It's kind of and the Holy Spirit kind of tends to be forgotten completely. Um, I think we struggle to make the Holy Spirit a person, um, um, and as opposed to just a spiritual force. But the Father thing um, is problematic for a lot of people, and I can see why. Um, you know, if you didn't have a good father, you didn't have a moral father. God as Father can be a struggle.
This has been so rich, Father Ron, and I'll land here today. This is actually the quote from the Shattered Lantern that, turned my world upside down. I had this moment where I woke up, and for a couple of weeks, just unusually anxious. I was irritable, but not upset, and I'm usually really good at naming my emotions, and for whatever reason, I just couldn't in this scenario. And here I am in my morning time with the Lord. I'm reading the Shattered Lantern, and I read this. Imagine taking a walk in the beautiful forest on a splendid summer's day. The earth is ablaze with the fire of God, and the sights, sounds, and smells are enough to make you want to take your shoes off before the burning bush. But if your mind and heart are hopelessly torn, and if, for example, you are painfully infatuated with someone who has just rejected you, you will see virtually nothing on this walk, not just of beauty and creation, but nothing at all. You are inside yourself, torn by your pain, endlessly reviewing past and future conversations, possibilities, and fantasies. For all you are actually seeing, hearing, or smelling of beauty in nature, you could just as profitably be walking in a parking lot or a rubbish dump. You're locked inside an inner world whose obsessive reality absorbs all your awareness. The outside world has little power to penetrate or even to distract you. Your reality has been reduced to the size, shape, and color of your own inner world. Father Ron, that is the story for so many people joined with us today. And I know in many ways we have covered and taught through the concepts related to that statement. Is there anything else you'd want to say to the listener who's saying, Father Ron, I'm exhausted. I'm desperately broken. I can't seem to find hope. I want to be formed. I know I am being formed. I just can't see right in front of me. What would you say to them as we close?
Well, I think a couple of things. First of all, to realize everybody's going to have moments like that. Um, what you described. If unless you die young, you're going to have some moments like that where the sun is shining, but not for you. And you're going to be locked inside of yourself and so on. So first of all, forgive yourself for being human and struggling like that. But then secondly, we got to recognize them. We got to say this isn't right. It's like an alcoholic at certain points that I need help. At a point like I say, like I need somebody, I need a mentor, I need a community, I need God, I need prayer, I need that to say like basically, it's like, I wish we had 12-step programs for obsession, for overwork, for whatever, see what 12-step programs do. They make the people aware of that. Say you're an addict, until it's pointed out, and um, so that and today I worry because for all the good of social media and our gadgets, it can be a way of almost being perpetually taken out of ourselves, um, and locked into false, or not just other worlds. But I'll just say one thing I heard from a very good psychologist on my graduate program, and it had to do with obsessions. So you've just lost somebody or something. He says, don't go into darkness alone. Don't do it. Always take somebody, something with you. Even Jesus had his father. The old expression I grew up on. They say, take your troubles to the chapel. He said, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes you're going to go to the chapel and you're going to eat yourself up inside. Go see a friend, do something that you got to break that obsession.
Wow. I can't thank you enough for investing in all of us today, Father Ron. Your work, your ministry has been formative in my formation journey, and I want to honor you and just say thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be with all of us today. I'm so grateful.
Well, thank you, Christopher. This is good, and I just hope that some of this is helpful to somebody.
I believe it. Yeah, I believe it will
and
be.
Blessings on your ministry.
Thank you.
And
yeah.
And this is like a podcast that goes out on to
all over. Yeah.
Okay.